The Reichssicherheitshauptamt building in Berlin stood like a monument to certitude. Granite, steel, windows that did not look outward but inward, as if the building itself refused to acknowledge the world beyond its walls. On the fourth floor, in a room labeled only with a number, 407, Obersturmbannführer Klaus Brenner sat at a desk that had belonged to 3 men before him. All 3 had been shot. It was June 1942. The war was still young enough to feel winnable. Brenner was 45 years old. His uniform was pressed with mathematical precision. His hair was cut in a style that suggested discipline rather than fashion. His eyes were the color of winter, not cold exactly, but the color of a season that had no pity. He had been with the SS since 1933, when joining meant belief, before belief became merely the price of survival. He had risen through the ranks, not because he was cruel, though he was, but because he was intelligent in a way that the party valued. He could see patterns, he could organize chaos, he could translate ideology into mechanism. This was his gift and his curse. He made terrible things work. His office was austere: a desk, a chair, a filing cabinet, a single painting on the wall, a landscape of the Bavarian Alps, all sharp peaks and clear lines, no ambiguity. Brenner had chosen it deliberately. He liked landscapes without clouds. He liked geometry. He liked systems that did not negotiate. On the desk in front of him lay a folder marked with a red stripe: Wolfshund, wolf dog. Inside were 6 months of work: cryptographic specifications, technical frameworks, the architectural blueprint for a cipher system that Brenner believed was impossible to break. He had been assigned to this project in November 1941, 6 months after the invasion of Russia. At that time, the Wehrmacht was still winning. At that time, German victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The existing Gestapo cipher systems, variations of the Enigma machine, were becoming vulnerable. Reports came back from the field. Radio signals intercepted, messages decoded, German operations compromised. The Allies were listening. Worse, they were understanding what they heard. The party leadership had convened a meeting. Security was discussed. Vulnerability was debated. And then someone, Brenner had never learned who, suggested that Klaus Brenner be tasked with creating a new system. A perfect system. A system that could not be broken because it was built on principles so inherently German, so tied to German thought and German language, that only a German mind could possibly understand it. Brenner had accepted the commission with satisfaction. Not pride. Pride was for men who doubted their abilities. Satisfaction. The knowledge that the task was suited to him and only him. He had retired to this room and begun to work. The design. The problem with Enigma was simplicity. The Allies had machines. They had captured Enigma machines. They understood the rotor principles. Understanding the machine was half the battle. The other half was breaking the daily settings, the rotor positions, the plug board configurations. But those were merely logistics. Americans had logistics. British had logistics. They could brute force their way through enough possible settings to find the right one. Wolfshund was designed to be different. It was not mechanical, it was algorithmic. It did not rely on machines, it relied on pure mathematical principle. The system worked like this. First, each operator received a master key, a long string of letters and numbers that generated all the daily substitution tables. The master key was not a physical object that could be stolen or captured. It was a procedure, a way of thinking. An operator would use the master key to generate day 1's substitution tables, then day 2, then day 3, all of it from pure logic, from pure German mathematical thinking. Second, the encryption itself used polyalphabetic substitution with daily key changes, but not random key changes. The changes were determined by astronomical events, the phase of the moon, the position of the sun relative to Berlin, the day number of the year combined with the hour of transmission. All of these were woven together into a mathematical function that was deterministic to Germans but would appear random to outsiders. Third, and most critically, the system used linguistic patterns from German classical literature, specifically from Goethe. Brenner had embedded references to phrases from Faust into the substitution tables. Certain letter combinations were reserved for messages about philosophical concepts. Other combinations appeared frequently in texts about scientific matters. A cryptographer who did not speak German, who did not understand German culture, would see only randomness. A German would see poetry encoded into mathematics. It was brilliant. It was also fundamentally flawed, though Brenner did not see the flaw. The flaw was that beauty is recognizable across cultures. Mathematics is universal. A pattern in the cipher would be a pattern whether a German saw it or an American saw it. The notion that German thought was somehow invisible to non-Germans was not science. It was ideology. But Brenner could not distinguish between the two. He had been trained since 1933 to believe that German superiority was a fact of nature, not an article of faith. He spent 6 months perfecting Wolfshund. He created the documentation. He wrote out the theoretical frameworks in longhand. He trained 3 radio operators personally, young men with SS tattoos and blank faces, teaching them how to generate daily key tables from the master key. They learned quickly. They learned perfectly. They would never deviate. By December 1942, Wolfshund was ready. The preparation, the high command, demanded a briefing before implementation. Brenner was summoned to a meeting with Obergruppenführer Heydrich's successor, a man named Walter Schellenberg. Schellenberg was younger than Brenner, younger and political in a way that suggested he understood that the war might be lost, that survival might require positioning rather than ideology. Brenner presented Wolfshund to him in a basement conference room. The presentation took 2 hours. Brenner drew diagrams on a blackboard using chalk in 3 colors: red for the master key, blue for the daily transformations, green for the literary anchors. He spoke in the precise German of a man who had never doubted himself. Schellenberg listened without interrupting. When Brenner finished, Schellenberg asked only one question: "Can it be broken?" "No," Brenner said. "It is based on principles that are too complex for foreign cryptographers to even conceive of. They are used to mechanical systems, machines. This is pure logic. This is German thinking embodied in mathematics." Schellenberg nodded. He did not look convinced, but he approved the system for immediate implementation across all Gestapo channels in occupied Europe. Brenner was assigned to tour the occupied territories and personally brief senior SS officers on the Wolfshund system. Not all of them. The codebooks were too sensitive. But the general officers, the territorial commanders, the men who would oversee its use, they needed to understand what they were using, even if they did not understand how it worked. The tour was scheduled for March 1943. The stops were Prague, Warsaw, Copenhagen, Paris, Brussels, 5 cities, 18 days. In each city, Brenner would deliver the same presentation. In each city, he carried the same briefcase. The document inside that briefcase were the technical specifications of Wolfshund. But there was also one other item: a single sheet of paper folded twice to fit in a leather portfolio. This sheet was the master key. Not the physical master key. There was no such thing. The master key was a procedure, a formula, a way of generating all the daily substitution tables from first principles. But Brenner had written it down in abbreviated notation, a kind of shorthand that only he fully understood. Columns of letters, strings of numbers. dates and lunar cycles and literary references encoded into symbols. Written out, it fit on a single page. Brenner had created this document for himself alone, not for distribution, not for the codebooks, just for him, a reference, a backup. His memory was impeccable. He could generate the daily tables in his head. But a true engineer, a true professional, always has a physical backup. Paper does not fail. Paper does not forget. Paper is reliable. He kept the master key in a leather folder, separate from the other documents. The folder was in his briefcase, always with him. He had memorized the contents, word for word, symbol for symbol, but he liked the knowledge that the paper existed. It gave him something like comfort. Copenhagen. The city was gray. It was March, and Copenhagen in March is a place where winter has not quite released its grip. The buildings were low and Dutch-looking, the streets orderly and calm. The occupation had been 2 years old by then. The Danes had learned not to resist, obviously, but there was a kind of passive resistance in the order itself, a refusal to acknowledge the swastika flags, a determination to continue living as though the Germans were not there. Brenner noticed none of this. He saw only the functional aspects of the city, the transport system, the communications infrastructure, the administrative apparatus. He was accompanied by 3 SS officers, local men, colonial administrators of occupation. The briefing was held in a secure room in the Wehrmacht Command Center. Brenner presented Wolfshund to 5 senior SS officers. He spent 2 hours drawing diagrams. He explained the master key principle without revealing the specific master key. He talked about the literary anchors without quoting the specific literary works. He made it sound both utterly convincing and utterly impenetrable. The officers nodded. They did not understand. They knew they did not understand. But they could see that the system was complex, that it involved German thought, that it must therefore be superior. When the briefing finished, one of the officers invited Brenner to dinner, a ritual of solidarity. Brenner accepted because protocol demanded it. The dinner. The restaurant was in the old part of Copenhagen, overlooking a frozen canal. They sat at a long table. There were 7 men, Brenner and 5 officers, and the restaurant owner, a German who had lived in Denmark since 1938. They ate Danish beef and drank German wine and spoke about the war. The conversation followed patterns: German military superiority, the inferiority of other races, the inevitability of final victory. One of the officers made a joke about the stupidity of the Russians. Another made a comment about the untrustworthiness of the Danes. Brenner listened and made appropriate responses. He did not contribute his own jokes or observations. He believed that humor was a form of weakness. It suggested a mind that could not maintain perfect discipline. After dinner, there was schnapps. A young SS man played a record on a gramophone, Wagner, Ride of the Valkyries. The music filled the restaurant. It was triumphant and terrible. Brenner excused himself to use the toilet. He stood and walked toward the back of the restaurant. His briefcase was leaning against his chair. He had been carrying it all evening, as he always did. When he returned, it was still there. When they all stood to leave, Brenner picked it up and checked inside. Everything was there: the technical specifications, the diagrams he had drawn for reference, the master key. He did not realize that it was not there. He did not realize that while he was gone, a young man had slipped into the restaurant, stolen the leather folder, photographed its contents in a back room using a small German-made camera, and returned the folder to Brenner's chair. By the time Brenner checked his briefcase, the master key had already been duplicated. The return to Berlin. Brenner returned to Berlin the next day. He filed his report on the Copenhagen briefing. The officers were well informed. They would spread the understanding of Wolfshund throughout the SS apparatus. All was proceeding according to plan. He submitted a brief note about the loss of the briefcase. noting that he had found it exactly where he had left it, with no sign of tampering. The note concluded, "The briefcase appears to have been temporarily displaced, but returned intact. No security breach is suspected. The sensitive materials were never exposed to unauthorized personnel." His superior officer, Standartenführer Emil Frick, read the note and filed it without concern. There would be paperwork if Brenner had suspected a real breach. But Brenner suspected nothing. Therefore, there was no breach. Brenner continued his tour: Prague, Warsaw, Paris, Brussels. In each city, he briefed senior officers on Wolfshund. In each city, his master key was safely in his briefcase. What he did not know was that in Aarhus, a small port city in Jutland, Denmark, a Danish resistor named Carl Rasmussen was looking at a piece of paper that changed everything. The resistor Carl Rasmussen was 32 years old. Before the war, he had been a librarian in Copenhagen, a keeper of books, an organizer of information, a man who understood that knowledge was a form of power. When the Germans occupied Denmark, Carl had initially tried to cooperate. Libraries were not political, he had thought. Books were not weapons. He had been wrong. By 1943, the German occupation of Denmark had become harsher. The Nazis were conscripting Danes to work in factories in Germany. They were increasingly moving against the resistance movement. Carl had watched his library colleague, a man named Peter, disappear one night. He had never learned what happened to Peter. He only knew that Peter had been taking books from the library, books about Russia, about socialism, about any ideology that the Nazis considered dangerous. After Peter disappeared, Carl became a resistor. He did not blow up bridges or kill Germans. He worked with intelligence. He passed information to the British through intermediaries. He helped hidden Jews cross the border to Sweden. He was not a soldier. He was a keeper of secrets. In March 1943, he was part of a group that was tracking Klaus Brenner's movements through Copenhagen. The Germans were developing new cipher systems. This much the resistance knew. The specifics were unknown. The goal was to discover what they were doing, if possible, to steal the documents. Carl was eating lunch in a cafe near the Wehrmacht command center when he saw Brenner arrive. Carl followed him. He watched as Brenner entered the briefing room. He waited, and when Brenner left the room at the end of the day, Carl noted that his briefcase was with him. That evening, when Brenner was at dinner with the SS officers, Carl made his move. He had a contact in the restaurant, a waiter who had been sympathetic to the resistance. The waiter let Carl in through the back. Carl walked through the restaurant and found Brenner's briefcase. He opened it. Inside were documents that meant nothing to him. Technical specifications in German, cryptographic diagrams in German, but there was also a leather folder. Carl opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in abbreviated notation, letters and numbers that looked like gibberish. Carl photographed it using a small Leica camera. The process took 3 minutes. Then he replaced the folder exactly as he had found it and left the restaurant. He did not understand what he had stolen, but he knew that if the Germans considered it important enough to carry in a locked briefcase, it must be worth sending to London. The transmission 3 days later, Carl was in a farmhouse in rural Jutland. A radio operator named Henrik Sorensen was sitting at a telegraph key, encoding Carl's message in Morse code and preparing to transmit it to British intelligence. The message said, "Obtained German cipher document. Appears to be encryption system key. German officer named Klaus Brenner carried it. Unknown significance. Attached is photographic reproduction." The transmission was sent on a frequency that the Germans were not monitoring, a frequency that had been established by MI6 agents the previous year. The signal traveled across the North Sea. It was received by a radio operator in a farmhouse near Bletchley Park. Within 6 hours, the document was in the hands of Alan Turing. Turing was the chief cryptanalyst at Bletchley Park, the British intelligence center where Enigma messages had been broken for 3 years. He was a brilliant man, a man who thought in mathematical abstractions, a man who could see patterns in chaos. He looked at Brenner's master key and knew immediately what it was. "This is the seed," he said to his assistant, showing the paper. "This generates all the daily keys. If we understand the algorithm, we can reconstruct every message encrypted with this system." "Can you break it?" the assistant asked. Turing smiled grimly. The Germans believed that because it was based on German thought, only Germans could understand it. They forgot that mathematics is universal. A pattern is a pattern, whether a German sees it or an Englishman sees it. He spent the next 2 weeks working on the algorithm. He mapped out the rotor functions. He identified the astronomical references. He recognized the literary anchors. He knew Goethe well enough to spot the patterns. And slowly, the system began to yield. By April 1943, Bletchley Park had reconstructed the full Wolfshund cipher. By May 1943, the British were reading every German Gestapo message in real time. The consequence, Brenner did not know any of this. He returned to Berlin after his tour of occupied Europe and resumed his position as chief cryptographer for the SS. He was satisfied with himself. Wolfshund was being implemented across all Gestapo channels. German communications were secure. The superior German mind had created a system that could not be broken. He did not notice that his superior officers seemed increasingly nervous. He did not realize that SS units across Europe were reporting that resistance movements were disappearing just before planned arrests. He did not understand why so many partisan groups seemed to know exactly when and where German sweep operations would occur. He attributed these things to coincidence, or to Gestapo competence, never to compromise. In his office, Klaus Brenner sat at his desk and continued his work, believing himself to be winning a war that was already lost. A single sheet of paper, lost in a Copenhagen restaurant, had given the Allies a window into the entire German intelligence apparatus. One piece of paper, one moment of carelessness, one belief in his own superiority that blinded him to the possibility of failure. And through that window, thousands of lives were saved. April 1943. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. The house was ugly. It was Victorian in the way that Victorian meant. Too many turrets, too many angles, too much stone pretending to be majesty. In 1943, it looked even worse because it had been converted into a military installation. Barbed wire surrounded it, guard posts at every gate. The gardens had been replaced with antennae and communications cables that looked like the nervous system of some vast, watching creature. Inside, in a basement room that had once been a wine cellar, Alan Turing sat at a desk covered in papers. He had not slept in 36 hours. His eyes were red. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear or nerves, but from the peculiar exhaustion that comes from sustained intellectual intensity. He was 40 years old. He had been breaking German ciphers since 1939. But this was different. This was Wolfshund. The Danish document had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Turing had immediately recognized what it was: a master key, not a physical object, but a seed, an algorithmic seed that could generate an entire encryption system. The Germans had created a cipher so complex that breaking it through brute force would have taken years. But they had made one mistake. They had written down the key. This mistake was not negligence. This was ideology. The Germans had believed that the key itself was useless without the context of German thought. They had believed that German mathematics was a kind of secret language that only Germans could speak. They had believed that the very nature of the system made it unbreakable to foreign minds. They were wrong. Turing had spent the last 3 weeks reconstructing the algorithm. He had worked with his team, mathematicians, linguists, cryptanalysts, but the core work was his alone. He sat in this basement room, surrounded by papers, and rebuilt Brenner's genius from scratch. The first step was identifying the pattern. Turing had studied the abbreviated notation on the master key and recognized immediately that it was based on polynomial substitution with shifting variables. The variables shifted based on astronomical events, specifically based on lunar phases and solar positions relative to Berlin. This was clever. This was elegant. This was also breakable once you understood the principle. The second step was identifying the cultural anchor points. Turing had noticed that certain letter combinations appeared with unusual frequency, and certain combinations appeared not at all. This suggested a linguistic pattern. He had recognized Goethe's hand in the construction, references to passages from Faust, to specific lines that would resonate with a German operator but mean nothing to anyone else. But here was the beauty. The patterns were still patterns. Even if you didn't know Goethe, even if you weren't German, you could see that certain letters appeared together more often than random chance would allow. You could map those patterns. You could understand that they represented not randomness, but structure. By the 15th day, Turing had reconstructed 40% of the daily key generation algorithm. By the 20th day, he had 85%. By the 21st day, he had it all. He looked at the final reconstruction and felt something like sadness. The system was beautiful. It was the work of a brilliant mind, and it was completely, utterly breakable. The implementation on May 1st, 1943, Wolfshund was broken. By May 2nd, Bletchley Park was reading German Gestapo messages in real time. By May 10th, they had decoded 12,000 messages from the previous 6 weeks, all the messages that had been sent using Wolfshund since its implementation. The messages were sorted, organized, cross-referenced. The patterns emerged. The Germans were everywhere and nowhere. The Gestapo messages revealed the entire intelligence apparatus of occupied Europe. They showed 7,400 resistance fighters identified and marked for arrest, specific safe houses in Prague, Warsaw, and Brussels that were under surveillance, the location of every Gestapo cell in Denmark, Belgium, and France, the names of 300 German informants embedded in resistance networks, the planned deportations of 180,000 people from occupied territories to labor camps in the Reich. For the first time in 3 years of occupation, the Allies had a complete picture of German intelligence operations, and they could act on it. The action. The first action came 48 hours after the cipher was broken. In Copenhagen, a Danish resistance cell was preparing to execute a Gestapo informant. They had been planning it for weeks. They believed their security was perfect. They believed their cell was safe. But the Allies had intercepted the Gestapo messages about them. The messages had identified the informant. The messages had even identified the date and location where the resistance would strike. The Gestapo had planned to ambush the ambush, to catch the resistance members in the act of committing murder, and thus prove them as terrorists rather than freedom fighters. The British sent a radio message to Copenhagen: "Do not execute on scheduled date. Security compromised. Informant is known to enemy. Relocate immediately." The resistance members received the message. They did not execute on the scheduled date. They did not get caught in the Gestapo's trap. The informant lived, for now, but the informant's value was destroyed. The Germans knew that the resistance knew about him. They could not use him again. This was repeated 1,400 times over the next 6 months. Safe houses that were about to be raided were evacuated before the Gestapo arrived. Resistance members who were about to be arrested were warned and disappeared. Informants who were about to be activated were exposed. Deportation trains that were about to depart were delayed, disrupted, sometimes prevented entirely. The Germans noticed that their arrests were becoming less effective. They noticed that resistance cells seemed to know when Gestapo operations were coming. They noticed that their informants kept being discovered before they could provide useful intelligence. Klaus Brenner noticed too. Brenner's suspicion. By July 1943, 3 months after Wolfshund's implementation, Klaus Brenner began to suspect that something was wrong. The indicators were subtle. The resistance movements were not being broken. They were adapting. They were moving. They were surviving with a success rate that made no sense given the level of German intelligence that should have been crushing them. Brenner requested a meeting with his superior officer, Standartenführer Emil Frick. He presented data, arrest rates in occupied territories, the survival rate of identified resistance cells, the effectiveness of German counterintelligence operations. The numbers are declining, Brenner said, showing a chart. In January 1943, our success rate was 71%. In March, when Wolfshund was implemented, it was projected to rise to 95%. Instead, it has declined to 48%. Frick looked at the chart without comprehension. Perhaps Wolfshund is still new, he suggested. Perhaps the radio operators have not yet mastered it. No, Brenner said. I have checked the traffic. The system is functioning perfectly. Every message is being encoded correctly. The problem is not with the cipher. The problem is that the enemy is responding to our operations before they happen. Frick's expression hardened. What are you suggesting, Brenner? I am suggesting that the cipher has been compromised. Frick stood. His face became cold. That is impossible. Wolfshund was designed by you. Only you understand it fully. If it is compromised, then the compromise is on your hands. I have reviewed every aspect of the system, Brenner said. The mathematics is sound. The implementation is correct. If there is a compromise, it did not come from technical weakness. Then from where? Frick demanded. Brenner did not answer immediately. He thought about Copenhagen. He thought about the briefcase that had been displaced. He thought about the files that had been in the lobby. He thought about the piece of paper that contained the master key, but that had been recovered. He had checked. Everything had been there, hadn't it? I do not know, he finally said. Frick's face was stone. You will implement new security protocols. You will oversee the re-encryption of all Wolfshund traffic with a new master key, and you will investigate the possibility of an informant within the SS. Is that clear? Yes, sir, Brenner said. The investigation for the next 3 months, Brenner conducted a purge. He suspected everyone. He tested the loyalty of his radio operators by giving them false information and seeing if it appeared in intercepted radio traffic. He examined the work of his subordinates for signs of deliberate error. He requested background checks on every person who had access to Wolfshund documentation. He did not suspect the most obvious possibility that the master key itself had been compromised. This was because admitting that possibility would mean admitting his own failure. It would mean admitting that he had made a mistake that had cost German intelligence operations their effectiveness across an entire continent. It would mean admitting that his belief in German superiority had blinded him to a very simple reality. That paper can be stolen, that security can fail, that an Obersturmbannführer can be careless. So instead, he suspected his men. He had 3 radio operators interrogated by the Gestapo. 1 died under interrogation. 1 was executed. 1 was released but transferred to a punishment battalion on the Russian front. The purge accomplished nothing. The resistance movements continued to survive. The arrests continued to fail. The German intelligence apparatus continued to be blind to what was happening in occupied territories. And Brenner continued to refuse to look at Copenhagen, continued to refuse to consider what might have happened in that hotel room, continued to tell himself that German systems could not fail, that German minds could not be outsmarted, that the only explanation for failure must be treason from within. The scope of defeat. What Brenner did not know was the scale of his defeat. From May 1943 to March 1945, a period of 22 months, Bletchley Park read virtually every Gestapo message sent in occupied Europe. The British intelligence services used this information to lives saved, 8,000 days. Resistance fighters were warned of German operations and escaped arrest or execution, 12,000 plus. People marked for deportation were hidden or evacuated before the trains departed, 80,000 plus. Civilians in occupied territories avoided immediate German operations targeting them. German intelligence disabled. 3,200 German informants were identified and their networks destroyed. 340 Gestapo operations were disrupted before they could be executed. The entire German counterintelligence system in Western Europe was made effectively blind operational impact. The invasion of Normandy succeeded partly because the Germans did not know where the Allies would land. This knowledge gap was created by the fact that German intelligence operations could not function effectively because their communications were compromised. The liberation of France was accelerated by an estimated 4 weeks because German counterinsurgency operations were failing across the board. German command and control in occupied territories collapsed in the final months of the war because the Germans were fighting an enemy they could not see. All of this stemmed from one piece of paper lost in a Copenhagen hotel room. The paranoia. By early 1944, Klaus Brenner was becoming unstable. The stress of the failure, the investigation that had gone nowhere, the knowledge that something was deeply wrong, it was breaking him. He requested a new investigation. He demanded that every German officer who had contact with Wolfshund documentation be investigated for possible espionage. His superiors resisted. The war was not going well. They did not have time for Brenner's paranoia, but Brenner persisted. He submitted reports. He requested meetings. He demanded action. In March 1944, his superior officer, Standartenführer Frick, summoned him to a meeting. Frick's face was grim. "You are being reassigned," Frick said. "Effective immediately, you are to cease all work on Wolfshund. You are being transferred to a position in the Reich Security Service in Berlin." "But the investigation," Brenner began. "There is no investigation," Frick interrupted. "There is only your inability to accept that your creation has failed. You have become a liability. You are being removed." "The cipher has been compromised," Brenner insisted. "I know it has. Something happened in Copenhagen." "Copenhagen," Frick said coldly, "was 3 months ago. If the cipher had been compromised, we would have seen evidence by now. Instead, I see a man whose mind is fracturing under the weight of his own doubt." "You are dismissed, Brenner." Brenner left Berlin on a train. He never worked on ciphers again. He spent the last year of the war in a bureaucratic position, processing paperwork for the Reich Security Service. He was nobody. The end on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. Klaus Brenner was captured by Soviet forces in Berlin. He was interrogated about Wolfshund. He explained the system. He explained the mathematics. He did not explain Copenhagen. He did not explain the missing piece of paper. The Soviets considered him a war criminal. They sent him to a camp in Poland. He died there in 1948, never knowing that his cipher had been broken, never understanding that his carelessness in a Copenhagen hotel room had changed the course of the war. The parallel in London, Alan Turing was celebrated. He was given medals. He was recognized as one of the great cryptanalysts of the war, but the specifics of Wolfshund remained classified. Turing himself was not supposed to talk about it. The war was over, but the secrets remained secrets. Turing lived for another 12 years. He died in 1954, never knowing the full scope of what his breaking of Wolfshund had accomplished. The details of the operation would not be declassified until decades later. The invisible victory. This was the true cost of Brenner's arrogance. Not that Germany lost the war, they would have lost anyway, but that Germany lost control of occupied territories months before the final military collapse. That 8,000 plus resistance fighters lived who would otherwise have died. That the entire German intelligence infrastructure in the West was rendered blind. Brenner had created a perfect cipher. Brenner had been defeated by a piece of paper, and he would never know it. November 1945, Nuremberg, Palace of Justice. The courtroom smelled of stone and defeat. High ceilings, windows that showed gray November sky, rows of benches for journalists, translators, witnesses. In the dock, Klaus Brenner sat with 14 other SS officers. Some of them had been generals, some had commanded concentration camps, some had organized deportations. Brenner was none of these things. He was an engineer, a cryptographer, a man who had made systems work. He was also a war criminal. The trial had been going on for 3 weeks. The prosecution was methodical. They presented documents, they called witnesses, they built a narrative of organized evil. But Brenner had not been part of organized evil. He had been part of organized control. There was a difference, at least in his mind. His defense attorney was a thin German named Heinz Müller. Müller had instructed Brenner to express remorse, to suggest that he had been following orders, to frame himself as a technical expert who had not understood the moral implications of his work. Brenner had refused. "I was an engineer," Brenner said to Müller. "I did my work. I did not make policy. I did not make decisions about who lived or who died. I made a cipher, a system, that is all." Müller had looked pained. "But that is not how the court will see it. They will see your work as contributing to German war crimes. You must express—" "I am not expressing anything false," Brenner said. "I will not demean myself before these people." These people. The court was made up of American judges, British judges, French judges, and one Soviet judge. Brenner saw them as representatives of the powers that had destroyed Germany. He would not grovel before them. The prosecution, on the morning of November 8, 1945, the American prosecutor Colonel Robert Jackson called a witness, Dr. Edmund Helmuth, a German intelligence officer who had served under Brenner. Helmuth was thin and nervous. He took the oath and sat in the witness box. Jackson began his questioning. "Dr. Helmuth, you worked under the defendant Klaus Brenner during the design and implementation of the Wolfshund cipher system, is that correct?" "Yes," Helmuth said quietly. "And you understood the purpose of that system. It was to protect German military communications, to make them unbreakable. And did you believe the system was unbreakable?" Helmuth hesitated. "We were told it was unbreakable. The defendant told us it was unbreakable." Jackson nodded slowly. He walked toward the evidence table. He picked up a document, a photostat of the master key that had been stolen in Copenhagen. It had been recovered from British files. "Dr. Helmuth, do you recognize this document?" Helmuth looked at the paper. His face went pale. "This is the master key to the Wolfshund cipher," Jackson said. "It was stolen from the defendant's briefcase in Copenhagen in March 1943. With this key, British cryptanalysts were able to break the entire Wolfshund system. Because of this breach, a breach that the defendant himself allowed to occur, German intelligence in occupied Europe was effectively blinded for the remainder of the war." Helmuth did not answer. He sat in his chair and said nothing. "The question is," Jackson continued, "what was the responsibility of Klaus Brenner for this catastrophic security failure?" Müller stood. "Objection. This is speculation about responsibility. The defendant cannot be held responsible for theft. Jackson smiled. I will rephrase. Dr. Helmuth, was Klaus Brenner aware of the possibility that sensitive documents could be stolen? Yes, Helmuth said. We all were. He trained us about security protocols, about carrying briefcases, about never leaving documents unattended. And did Klaus Brenner follow these protocols? Helmuth's voice became very quiet. No, he left his briefcase unattended in a hotel lobby in Copenhagen. The courtroom fell silent. Brenner's response: Mueller advised Brenner not to testify. Let them establish their facts. Give us time to prepare a response. But Brenner insisted on testifying. On November 10th, he took the stand. He was dressed in a simple suit. His hair was combed. He looked like a man who had expected to die and was surprised to still be alive. Jackson approached him with the master key. Mr. Brenner, is this your handwriting? Brenner looked at the document. It was his handwriting, the abbreviated notation, the mathematical symbols, the columns of numbers and dates. Yes, he said. Why did you write this document? As a reference, a backup. A backup for what? For myself, in case I needed to quickly verify a calculation. Jackson's voice became sharp. You carried the master key to the Wolfshund cipher system, the key that, if compromised, would render the entire system breakable, in a leather folder in a briefcase that you left unattended in a hotel lobby in Copenhagen. Is that correct? Brenner's jaw tightened. Yes. And when you discovered the briefcase was missing, briefly missing, you did not raise a security alert? The briefcase was returned. Everything was in order. Everything was in order except the master key, Jackson said, which had been photographed. Brenner did not respond. Jackson walked back to the evidence table. He picked up another document, a British intelligence report, showing the reconstruction of the Wolfshund algorithm. Mr. Brenner, are you aware that within 3 weeks of the loss of this master key, British cryptanalysts had reconstructed the entire Wolfshund system? I am aware of it now, Brenner said. And if you had properly reported the possible theft of this document, if you had implemented new security measures, if you had rekeyed the entire system, would the British have been able to read your communications? Mueller objected. Speculation, Jackson rephrased. Mr. Brenner, in your professional opinion as a cryptographer, if the master key had been changed immediately upon discovery of the loss, would the British have been able to break the new system using their knowledge of the algorithm? Brenner hesitated. He could see where this was going. No, he said quietly. If I had changed the algorithm, their knowledge of the old one would have been useless. But you did not change the algorithm, Jackson said. You did not report a security breach. You told yourself that the document was worthless without context. You told yourself that foreign minds could not understand your creation. And because of your arrogance, because of your belief in German superiority, German intelligence operations were blind for 22 months, correct? Mueller objected again, but Jackson had made his point. The historical evidence. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution presented evidence of the consequences of the Wolfshund breach. They presented statistics on German intelligence failures in occupied Europe. They presented testimony from British officers about how they had used the broken cipher to save resistance fighters and prevent German operations. They presented maps showing the liberation timeline and how it was accelerated by German intelligence collapse. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was an intercepted message from Nazi leadership, dated September 1943, expressing frustration that resistance movements seem to know of our operations before they occur. The message concluded, either we have a leak in command, or the enemy has broken our cipher. investigate all possibilities. Klaus Brenner had ordered that investigation. It had revealed nothing because the leak was not in command. The leak was in Brenner's own briefcase. The testimony of Alan Turing. On November 15, 1945, the prosecution called a British witness, Dr. Alan Turing, the mathematician who had broken the Wolfshund cipher. Turing was nervous in the courtroom. He did not like public speaking, but he answered the prosecutor's questions methodically. Dr. Turing, how long did it take you to break the Wolfshund cipher once you had possession of the master key? Approximately 21 days, Turing said. And without the master key? Impossible to estimate, perhaps years, perhaps never. So the stolen master key was essential to breaking the cipher. Yes, without it the system would have been effectively unbreakable. Jackson paused. He let this fact settle into the courtroom. Dr. Turing, the master key was stolen as a result of the defendant's carelessness. If he had not lost the document, would you have been able to break Wolfshund? Muller objected, but Turing answered anyway. No, we would not have been able to break it. Jackson turned to look at Brenner. And because you were able to break Wolfshund, what was the result? Turing looked at the judge, then at Brenner. We were able to read virtually every German Gestapo message for 22 months. We identified thousands of German informants. We prevented thousands of arrests. We saved thousands of lives. How many? Jackson asked. Approximately 8,000 resistance fighters, perhaps another 180,000 civilians who were marked for arrest or deportation. We cannot know the exact number. The defense Muller's defense was straightforward. Brenner was a technical expert, not a war criminal. He had designed a cipher system. The loss of the master key was an accident, not a deliberate breach. The consequences of that accident were not his responsibility. Muller called experts who testified that Wolfshund was a masterpiece of cryptography. He called SS officers who testified that Brenner had always emphasized security protocols. He called other members of the cryptography team who said that Brenner had been a professional and a dedicated engineer. But all of this testimony was undermined by one fact. Brenner had lost the master key, and he had not reported it properly. Muller tried to argue that in war, accidents happen, that one mistake does not make a man a war criminal, that Brenner's intention was to serve his country, not to aid the enemy. But Jackson's closing argument was devastating. Klaus Brenner created a system to protect German communications. He was given a responsibility to protect that system from compromise. He failed in that responsibility. Because of his failure, his arrogance, and his belief that German minds were superior to all others, the Allies were able to read German military communications for the final 22 months of the war. This information led directly to the prevention of German operations that would have resulted in thousands of deaths. Jackson paused. He looked directly at Brenner. The defendant says he was just an engineer, just a technical expert, but his negligence was not merely technical. His arrogance was not merely professional. He was a Nazi who believed in the superiority of the German race and the inevitability of German victory. This belief blinded him to ordinary security protocols. This belief caused him to lose a document that changed the course of the war, and for this he must be held accountable. The verdict came on November 22, 1945. Klaus Brenner was found guilty of negligence contributing to military failure and membership in a criminal organization, the SS. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was not unanimous. One judge, the Soviet judge, had wanted a harsher penalty. The others had wanted to show mercy, arguing that Brenner was not a murderer, not a torturer, merely a man who had made a mistake. But the American and British judges had been convinced by Jackson's argument. They believed that Brenner's belief in German superiority, his arrogance, his refusal to acknowledge the possibility of failure, these were the true crimes. Not what he had done deliberately, but what he had failed to do through willful blindness. The last words Klaus Brenner was hanged on December 16, 1945. 3 weeks after his sentencing, he walked to the gallows with dignity. He did not weep. He did not beg for forgiveness. He wore the same suit he had worn to trial. The German chaplain asked if he had any final words. Brenner looked at the assembled witnesses, journalists, officers, guards. He looked out at a world that had turned his Germany to ash. "I was an engineer," he said. "I believed in the superiority of German thinking. I believed that a German mind could create something that non-German minds could not break. I was wrong. Not about the superiority of German engineering, that was real, but about the universality of mathematics. Mathematics is the language of the universe, not the language of Germany. A pattern is a pattern. A code is a code. And if you are blind to your own blindness, then you cannot see even what is before your eyes." He paused. "I lost a piece of paper in a hotel room. Because I was arrogant, because I was convinced of my own perfection, I did not report it. Because of this, 8,000 people lived who would otherwise have died. I do not know if this makes me a savior or a criminal. I only know that my arrogance destroyed the thing I created to preserve, and that is my sentence." The chaplain asked if he had anything else to say. "No," Brenner said, "I am ready." He was hanged at 6:47 a.m. The epilogue in London, Alan Turing received a letter from the British government. It thanked him for his service and offered him a position in the British intelligence service. He refused. He went back to Manchester, back to his work in pure mathematics. He never spoke publicly about Wolfshund again. The secrecy classification would remain in place for another 40 years. He lived until 1954. He died by his own hand, a small bite of cyanide-laced apple. The official story was accidental poisoning. The truth was more complicated. His work had won the war, but the peace had no use for Alan Turing. The world that had celebrated his genius in 1945 rejected him in 1954 because of his sexuality. He died alone in his small house, a genius who had changed the course of history and received no recognition for it. In Denmark, Carl Rasmussen lived a long life. He became a librarian again after the war. He never told anyone about the stolen document. He never claimed credit for what had been accomplished. He simply returned to organizing books, to cataloging information. He died in 1987 at the age of 76. At his funeral, a British intelligence officer, now retired, came to pay his respects. They did not speak, but the officer left a single photograph on Rasmussen's grave, the master key to the Wolfshund cipher. Carl had never known what he had stolen. Now he would know. The final reckoning in 1974, the Wolfshund story was declassified. Historians began to study what had happened. They traced the chain: Brenner's arrogance, Copenhagen hotel room, master key theft, Turing's reconstruction, 8,000 plus lives saved. One historian wrote, Brenner believed that his creation was proof of German superiority. Instead, it was proof of the opposite. It proved that superiority is fragile, that one moment of carelessness can destroy systems built on arrogance, and that the universe speaks a universal language that no nation can monopolize. Another historian noted the irony. Brenner spent 6 months creating a perfect cipher. He destroyed it in an instant by leaving a piece of paper on a hotel chair. In this, he revealed the ultimate truth about war. Not the victor, but the careless, the blind, the arrogant. These are the ones who determine the course of history. Klaus Brenner had believed that German thinking was unique, that German minds operated according to principles that others could not comprehend. But he had been wrong. Mathematics is universal, patterns are universal, and arrogance is the same whether it wears a German uniform or any other uniform. His cipher was broken not because he had made an error in the mathematics, but because he had made an error in believing himself above ordinary human failure, and in that error lay the seed of his defeat.